All right, Alexander, let's do an update on what is going on in Ukraine. And let's start things off with the F-16 saga. We have an update on the F-16 plan. Is it a plan or is it a scheme or a trick? Because that's the way I'm looking at it. This seems like a very bad idea, and it involves Romania and Poland. Anyway, what is going on with the F-16s?
Well, it's an incredibly bad scheme, and it's an attempted trick. So the idea is that you don't actually base most of the F-16s. I understand they're talking about most of the F-16s in Ukraine itself. The runways really haven't been brought to the level where they can operate F-16s. The infrastructure is apparently nowhere near ready. The Russians are able to attack these runways at will, and they've been wreaking massive destruction upon them. So the idea is that you keep them in Poland and Romania. And the way it's been presented is that they will be stored there, whatever that means, so that they're outside the reach of the Russians. In practice, I think that this is another scheme to try to base Polish F-16s in Polish and Romanian air bases, pretend that isn't really what's going to happen. The Russians have previously said that if the F-16s take off from these Polish and Romanian air bases and engage the Russians, then the Russians will counterstrike the F-16s in those bases. And again, I've no reason to doubt that this is what the Russians will indeed do. I suspect this was the plan all along, because realistically, there was never any way that the F-16s could operate from the air bases in in Ukraine. It only made sense if they were indeed going to be operated from the bases in Romania and Poland. So you tell people, well, don't worry, we're only storing them there. They're not actually going to be based there. But if you unpick the story, based in Poland and Romania is absolutely what this is all about.
I'm having a hard time understanding this story, to be quite honest. From what I understand, they're going to be based in Romania. From what I gather, most of the activity is going to take place from Romania.
Yeah.
They're saying they're just going to be stored there, but that's where the airfield is.
Yes.
Are they going to be taking off from Romania? I've read some reports saying that they're going to take off from Romania and be armed in Ukraine and then run their mission from Ukraine and then go back to Romania. I don't understand. They're going from Romania? Are they going to land in Ukraine and then take off again from Ukraine, or
that's
just
that's
explain. This is so. Go.
That's the fairy tale we've been spun. That they're going to take off from Romania, fly into Ukraine, presumably to the big air base at Staro-Konstantinov. They'll be armed with all their weapons there. Then they'll take off from the air base in Staro-Konstantinov and the others in Ukraine and engage the Russians. I mean, that makes absolutely no military sense whatsoever. Even I, who am not a military person, can see that is absolute nonsense. I mean, there are so many possibilities for things to go wrong that one can't even begin to count. So clearly, the real objective is to operate the F-16s from the bases in Romania. And that's been what they've been planning all along. I think they've been spinning this story because, of course, the Russians have said that they will strike at the bases in Romania. They don't want people in Romania in particular to get too nervous and worried about this. So they're selling us this story that they'll be taking off from the bases in Romania, landing in Ukraine, being armed in Ukraine, and then we'll fight the Russians.
So what happens when the Russians hit the base where they land in Ukraine? What happens when they destroy that on day one? On day one, that base is gone. Then what's the story?
Well, then what is indeed the story, and what does the West do? I mean, this is the problem.
I don't understand. I'm trying to understand this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what happens when the Russians strike the base in Romania? Does Article 5 then
the base in Ukraine.
Oh, when the base is in Ukraine, when they destroy the base in Ukraine.
They land in Ukraine, they arm, and then they run their combat mission. Okay, so day one, Russia destroys that base in Ukraine.
Yeah, which it has repeatedly done. Well, then, as I said, either if the project is as they're pretending as. If that is the case, then of course the F-16s can't operate. They're stranded in Romania. They can't fly because they have to be armed in Ukraine. I mean, we can't have F-16s flying into Ukrainian airspace unarmed because that would make no sense. But of course, as I said, that is not the plan. The plan is to operate the F-16s from the bases in Romania. I mean, that is the only thing that makes any kind of sense here, and that clearly is the plan. It's another massive escalation. They're lying. But they're lying, exactly. It's another, what a surprise. But I mean, they're lying. I mean, it's another massive escalation. They're doing something which is incredibly dangerous. They're trying to tell everybody, don't worry, the Russians won't attack the bases in Romania because, in fact, the F-16s won't be armed there. They'll be armed in Ukraine when they fly into Ukraine and land on the air bases in Ukraine.
They're just stored in Romania. They're just stored there.
It's just stored there, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, we're not a party to this war. Okay.
We're not a party to this war.
Yeah, so let's talk about Zelensky a bit. And he's in Germany.
Yeah.
You would think that after the EU elections, Germany would cancel this recovery event that they're having. Maybe they would tell Zelensky, stay away. It's not a good time. Let's postpone this event and let's postpone your trip. But no. Come to Germany, Zelensky. Let's have a big event. Ursula's there. Schultz is there. They're applauding Zelensky. They're talking about Ukraine and the European Union. Meanwhile, Zelensky is facing a lot of trouble. Back home. He obviously doesn't want to go back to Kiev. The Financial Times is hinting at the fact that Zelensky might very well be on the way out. What is going on here?
Well, let's just talk about his visit to Germany, which is, of course, partly all about, Ukraine making its EU membership application. This, as you said, directly after European Parliament elections, in which anti-Ukraine in EU parties, the AfD, Sarah Wagenknecht's party, they've surged. But of course, we don't pay any attention to that. We don't concern ourselves with what the German people are trying to communicate to us. We ignore completely the words of the head of the German stock market, the German Bus, who has been saying that the economic policy of the Scholz government has been catastrophic. We pay no attention to any of this. Our priority remains Project Ukraine. Clearly in Germany, we're far more comfortable dealing with him than we are with our own people and addressing their concerns. I mean, the wooden-headedness of the European leadership in this is absolutely astonishing. And their arrogance is incredible. I mean, they're now going to be all moving on to their conference in Lucerne, where only they will be present, even the Americans. I mean, the Americans are sending Kamala Harris, which tells you what the Americans actually think of this conference. So, I mean, it's going to be the European political class talking to itself, applauding Zelensky, even as it becomes increasingly clear that the European public is cooling and turning against him. And not just the European public, because it's now increasingly obvious to me that within Ukraine, the government, people within the elite are now turning against him, and they are being encouraged to do so by powerful people within the United States. And that's where we come back to the Financial Times article, because we know this is the second article that the Financial Times has published in, I think, just over 2 weeks about Zelensky, and which is deeply critical of him. If you remember, there was an article about 2 weeks ago which said that Zelensky was becoming paranoid, that he was becoming increasingly out of touch, that his relationships with Biden and the US administration had become awful, that he was constantly demanding the impossible from the Americans, that officials within his own government were becoming increasingly exasperated with him. Well, what's happened now is that there has been the resignation from the Ukrainian government of the infrastructure minister. This is not unusual. It happens a lot in Ukraine. And by the way, and just for the record, the infrastructure system in Ukraine has been plagued with corruption issues. The infrastructure ministry was charged with creating all the great fortified lines in Kharkiv and elsewhere, which never existed. I mean, there might be good reasons why this particular minister has been asked to resign or has resigned, which have no connection to what we're being told by the Financial Times. That the Financial Times is spinning this story as another example of the chaos and dysfunction within the Ukrainian government. We're told that Zelensky and his officials have been freezing out this official for some time. He's not been invited to attend key meetings, including meetings in which he interacts with Western officials. The Western officials supposedly have liked him and have worked well with him, that they're angry with his dismissal. And there is a comment by a Ukrainian official who chooses obviously to remain anonymous, that this is another one of those supposedly inexplicable personnel decisions that Zelensky is making that is causing concern and alarm amongst Ukraine's supporters in the West. So it's another article appearing in the Financial Times telling us that Zelensky's government is collapsing, that is becoming dysfunctional, that Zelensky is making inexplicable and bizarre decisions, and that obviously he is antagonizing the Western powers, and that it looks increasingly as if he's not the right person to go on leading Ukraine. I cannot help but think that articles like this, planted in the Financial Times, strongly neoliberal, neocon newspaper, are fervently supportive of the Project Ukraine, very, very close to the Biden administration, extremely close to the Biden administration. The fact that these articles are appearing, one after the other, is a clear sign that the Americans are losing confidence in Zelensky, and that, exactly as Putin said, they're preparing to move him out.
Yeah, but the Europeans, the EU, or at least a part of the EU faction, Ursula, Schultz, Annalena, these guys, they want to keep Zelensky in.
Yeah.
So I think that's basically the only thing that's holding Zelensky in power at the moment is this EU group of people that, for some reason, maybe they're completely invested in Zelensky, whatever it is, they don't want to see Zelensky go, and they're showing him as much support as they possibly can.
Absolutely, that's exactly correct. Of course, they're doing that. They're going to all turn up to his conference in Lucerne. It's absolutely clear now, by the way, that Zelensky was the major organizer of the conference in Lucerne. Apparently, he's the person, not the Swiss, who's been sending out all the invitations and doing all of that, which confirms your analysis that it was all about getting the global community to legitimize him as president. But all right, most countries are either going to send very low-ranking delegations or are going to boycott this thing completely. Only the Europeans are there. But notice again that the Americans are sending. I say only send. They're only sending Kamala Harris. Biden himself is not going, which is, to my mind, a significant vote of no confidence in Zelensky. The Europeans are backing Zelensky, but the reality is, as everybody knows, that it is the United States that runs the show in Kiev. So, if the Americans decide that Zelensky must go he will. And all of these people, Annalena, Ursula, Olaf, and the others, who are crowding around Zelensky, telling him, well, you're a great man, you're the hero of the hour, you're the person we completely and wholly support. Again, they're quite likely, if they're not careful, well, of course, they're never careful, but they're very likely to find that, the rug has been pulled underneath them again by the Americans when the Americans decide that Zelensky must go, which I think is starting to come. By the way, I'm also getting the sense that the British, who are obviously joined to the Americans at the hip, that they're cooling on Zelensky as well. So just saying. So, the Anglo-Americans are the people who make the decisions in Kiev, not the Germans, not the French, not the Italians, not the Dutch or the Belgians, and certainly not Ursula. And as I said, they're, embracing Zelensky. But if he's out, he's out. And they will look incredibly foolish when that happens. And will the Americans care? Of course not.
Does Sunak going to the peace conference, does that signal that the UK is supporting Zelensky, or it's meaningless? Sunak.
It's meaningless. It's completely meaningless because he's going to be out in a few weeks anyway. So, nobody takes Sunak at all seriously any longer. So I think that it is meaningless. And the rumours in Britain is that when the election is over and the Conservatives crash, Sunak will leave British politics and Britain completely. And he and his wife will go to the United States.
To work for Obama. That's my prediction.
To work for Obama, yeah, absolutely.
That's my prediction. That's why Obama was at 10 Downing Street. Anyway, that's just a guess. Let's talk about another front possibly opening up. That's Sumy. A fifth front. What are you hearing? What are you
this is a very
about the possibility of Sumy?
This is a very, very strange business. So there's a village in Sumy region. Sumy region is a big region lying west of Kharkiv region. There's been lots of speculation over the last couple of weeks that the Russians are about to advance in force into Sumy region. Now, the key thing to understand is that Sumy region lies quite close to Kiev itself. If the Russians were to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops in Sumy region, as some people in Kiev have been saying, that would bring those troops very close to Kiev. In fact, we might start getting the siege of Kiev too, only with a much more powerful army than the one we saw in 2022. That would be a real crisis for Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are very, very nervous and very, very worried and frightened about this. And Zelensky in particular, it seems, is in a state of, panic that this might happen. So yesterday we got these reports that a village in Sumy region had been occupied by the Russians. And indeed, the Russians are there. And when I say the Russians, it turns out that these are what you might call irregular troops of the Russian military. They are part of the Russian military system, but they seem to be made up of Chechen forces, and ex-people from the Wagner organization. Anyway, they've crossed the border. They've occupied this village. There's an awful lot of shelling and bombing by the Russian military going on in the area. But it's not clear for the moment that there's a real plan by the Russians, or that this is a real plan by the Russians to advance beyond this village. So what exactly is going on? Maybe the Russians are testing the Ukrainian defenses. Maybe this is just a reconnaissance in force. Maybe it's the first stage of an offensive, or maybe they want to spook Zelensky even more. They know how scared Zelensky is, and so they occupy a village in Sumy region. That's going to cause Zelensky to get hysterical with his generals, which he apparently is most of the time now. Call them, say, we got a crisis in Sumy region, we got to divert even more troops to Sumy region, and to try to stabilize the situation there, because the Russians are coming, they're about to march on Kiev. I can't afford to leave Sumy region. We can't afford to leave Sumy region unguarded. That will strip other Ukrainian forces along the front lines of even more troops. It will draw off even more Ukrainian reserves. It will thin out the lines even further, and that will enable the Russians to attack even more strongly in other places. It's very difficult at this moment in time to know what the Russians are planning. And they want it that way. They want to keep all of us guessing. And of course, the person they want to keep guessing most of all is Zelensky himself. And they're doing it with great skill. But anyway, they've occupied this village. We'll see what they do next.
All right, let's wrap up the video with other news from the front line. What else is going on?
It is more of the same, only it's in some ways getting faster. So over the last 2 weeks, lots of talk that the Ukrainians were going to organize some kind of counterattack in Kharkiv region, that they were going to push the Russians back across the border. I suspect that is what Zelensky and maybe Syrskyi promised the Americans. They said that you give us the permission to launch strikes deep inside Russia. If we get it, we will launch these strikes deep inside Russia. That will enable us to go back on the counterattack in the Kharkiv area. We'll push the Russians back, push them back across the border, even occupy maybe some parts of Russia, some of the border villages, which we've been trying to capture for a long time. And that might force Putin into negotiations. I suspect this is one of the discussions that has been going on. Anyway, there have been sporadic Ukrainian attempts to counterattack in Kharkiv region. Every one of them has failed. And the information that we're getting, and it's now confirmed by pictures of film and all that, is that it's the Russians in Kharkiv region who are still advancing. They seem to be capturing more and more of this town of Volchansk, and they seem to be outflanking the Ukrainians in the other place that is being fought over, which is a place called Lipsy. But in a sense, this remains still a sideshow. The main fighting is in Donbass, as it has always been. Now, the Russians have apparently come very close now to capturing a district of Chasiv Yar, which is at the very eastern end of Chasiv Yar, west or east of an aqueduct that cuts through Chasiv Yar. The Russians are very close to capturing that district, apparently heavily fortified. They've got troops to the north and south of Chasiv Yar. It looks like there's going to be a major Russian attack on Chasiv Yar at some point over the next few weeks. Almost certainly Chasiv Yar is going to fall. That will create another massive hole in Ukrainian defense lines. They've accepted, the Ukrainians themselves admit, if they lose Chasiv Yar, the way is open for the Russians to capture all kinds of other towns and to reach Kramatorsk, the big city in Donbass, still under Ukrainian control, and to advance even further towards the Dnieper, if that's what they choose to do. So this is a very important battle, and the Ukrainians are losing it. And elsewhere, we had more news this morning that in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area, where the Russians have punched a huge hole in Ukrainian defenses, they're making that hole bigger. They apparently, allegedly, the reports are saying they've captured another important strategic village there called Novo-Alexandrovka, that they did it this morning. And it looks as if not only is that hole getting bigger, but now the Russians are reaching the main supply lines that the Ukrainians use to keep their troops in Donbass equipped, and they're coming very, very close to Ukraine's main supply bases in Donbass as well. So, it's a crisis that gets worse by the day, and which the Ukrainians show no ability to reverse. They're desperately short of men. I mean, I think you've seen the pictures of the old men, weighed down with their helmets, and that apparently is, so I'm told, pretty commonplace sight amongst Ukrainian soldiers now. There's more reports that Ukrainian soldiers in many places are fleeing rather than standing up to fight, which is a change from what we saw earlier in the war. There's fewer and fewer signs of Ukrainian tanks. Ukrainian tanks are becoming few in number. The only infantry fighting vehicles, the vehicles that the Ukrainians actually use to transport infantry in, the only ones that I see anymore are the ones the Americans have supplied, the Bradleys and the Strikers, and they are relatively few in number. And the Russians have been systematically annihilating Ukraine's artillery systems. I mean, there are fewer and fewer guns, firing fewer and fewer shells. So the situation on the front lines right across Ukraine is getting weaker. And, there's also confirmation that the energy system is now in deep crisis. The economy, the fact that they're trying to enlist more and more men means there's fewer men working in the economy now. It's apparently now having a major impact on the economy, together with a collapse in the electricity system. The hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency, has gradually started to slip, apparently at the rate of about 2% a month. That may not sound big, but in a situation where the economy is effectively contracting and is no longer supplying goods, it's perhaps a warning sign that a really severe inflation crisis is around the corner, despite all the Western help. From every conceivable point of view, from every perspective, the situation is grim. And in any rational universe, a responsible Ukrainian leadership at this point would understand that the war is lost and would be trying to open negotiations with the Russians. Zelensky won't do that. There doesn't seem to be anyone else in Kiev who's prepared to do that either. They're quarreling and fighting and intriguing with each other. The Americans want to keep the war going, and so do the Europeans, because they have their own particular political investment that they're worried about. And so the war goes on, even as Ukraine itself is being destroyed.
Yeah, just a final thought, listening to everything that's happening. Big picture view, it looks like the Russians are waiting for the right moment to crash the whole thing down.
Absolutely.
That's how it looks.
Yeah, I agree.
They may be timing it to crash it all down. Kharkov direction, Chasov Yar, Sumy, the economy, the hryvnia, the Zelensky's troubles. If they time this thing right, the whole thing is just going to collapse. Slowly, and then all at once. That may be what could be happening. They should negotiate this thing right away.
Absolutely,
they really should.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I think. By the way, a lot of people speculate about Russian timing and why the Russians are doing this in this kind of way, and are wondering. I think what the Russians are doing always is that they want to make sure that they have all their pieces in place. I mean, they've been training large numbers of troops over the last year and a half, and I think that not all of those troops are ready. And it was very interesting that at the St. Petersburg conference, which has just ended in St. Petersburg in Russia, Putin actually said, we've been taking it very slow, but we might suddenly decide to move fast, to hurry. And I think that's a thing that people ought to remember. Attrition wars, we were saying this, by the way, in the opening weeks of this war. Attrition wars, when they end suddenly. Everything falls apart at once. It's happened in the First World War. It happened in the American Civil War. It happened, by the way, in Vietnam. The front lines for a long time seem stable, but they become thinner and more fragile. And then suddenly everything collapses in on itself very dramatically, taking a lot of people by surprise.
All right, we will end it there. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and Twitter X. And go to the Duran shop, use the code football24 and pick up some football merch. Take care.